Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Next week, the US will hold a virtual summit on the climate crisis, to which it invited 40 world leaders to participate. Malaysia, however, did not make the list. According to the Environment and Water Minister Tuan Ibrahim Tuan Man, Malaysia was not invited as we are categorised as a country. We are not categorised as a country vulnerable to climate change. Now, was our exclusion from the US Leaders Summit on Climate as significant as critics claim? So over the next half an hour, we're going to be taking a closer look at our readiness to participate in global climate conversations like the United Nations COP26, which is scheduled for November. Joining us first on the show, we have Lavanya Rama Iyer. She's the Head of Policy and Climate Change for WWF Malaysia. Hello, good evening, Lavanya. Now, what do you make of Malaysia not being invited to the US Leaders Summit on Climate? And do you agree with some quarters who see it as a snub? I mean, this reflecting Malaysia's lack of commitment to addressing the climate crisis? What do you think?
Hi, Melisa. Hi, Sharaad. Thanks so much for having WWF on the show today. Now, firstly, I think it is good to see actually the Biden administration, the US now under the Biden administration, taking a very different stance on climate change. And hopefully, this will instigate action that we urgently need, which is really the sufficient funding, technology transfer, as well as capacity building of developing countries so we can achieve development trajectories without repeating the mistakes of the developed world. Now, okay, so with that background, to answer your question, I cannot really speak for the host country, the US, on the reasons behind, who they choose to invite. It's really their prerogative, right? At the end of the day, though, there are many, many conferences on climate. It's become such an important issue. And hosts will seek to engage as they see fit. What is important to note, as some like Meena Raman from Third World Network have already commented on, is that we stay strongly committed and engage in the UN process. And the UN process is the one that is the official channel for global climate action. And what is actually little known is that Malaysia has been leaders in the sphere in the past. For example, during the early days of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the convention that deals with climate change globally, we had very recognized leaders in climate negotiations. The likes of the former Director General of the Meteorology Department, the late Mr. Chow Kok Kee, was really instrumental in contributing to many things. For example, crafting the Kyoto Protocol. He also helped to pave the way for resolving, a number of impasses in the negotiations at that time. And recognizing all that, he was elected as the chair of some of these very important technical bodies under the convention that guide action and decision-making in the process for global action under the convention. More recently as well, we have had equally illustrious negotiators, for example, Prof. Gurjal Singh, and as leader of this negotiating bloc called the Like-Minded Developing Countries, we were spokesperson for that bloc. We were able to actually help shape the Paris Agreement to be a more balanced one that reflected the principles upon which global climate action could be collectively undertaken.
Yeah, Lavanya, there's the issue of, and you mentioned, the idea of shared but differentiated responsibility. I think these are very interesting conversations that, the climate, the global climate conversation has revolved around. I wonder if you could take us through some of the most significant ones now, especially in terms of things that struck the Malaysian public as the Minister for Environment and Water suggested. He said, well, we're not a country vulnerable to climate change. Now, the question of vulnerability, how do we deal with that? And was it even true to make such a suggestion?
Look, there is actually no country that is spared the impacts of climate change, right? It just varies in terms of the degree to which we experience it. So Malaysia is lucky in that sense because we are not in that category which is so severely impacted. For example, we would not be in the same category of vulnerability like the Pacific Island countries, right? Who are at risk of completely disappearing with rising sea levels caused by global warming. So actually, Malaysia has been tracking and reporting on our vulnerability, especially on observed changes in rainfall pattern. I think we have all seen that in our lifetimes, and also reported this periodically in these UN reports called the national communications. And we've been undertaking these exercises to project future climate impacts, future climate change, and assessing the implications of that to things like our food security for a while now. So, you can have a look. We have completed 3 of these reports called the national communications. They are all freely available online. So the information is there. And furthermore, in our commitment to the Paris Agreement, each country has made a commitment to address climate change under the Paris Agreement. These are called the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. In that, Malaysia is amongst a group of countries that not only mentions mitigation action, but also adaptation action, adaptation to the impacts of climate change, recognizing that we're already facing impacts.
Okay. So, Lavanya, if I may ask you then, if having said that, are you seeing a certain urgency in Malaysia's policies in the way we've structured our national plans and the programs that we're rolling out? Is the climate crisis being addressed through these different ministries?
Well, I think it's fair to say that over the years, you have seen a progressive, positive shift towards this. You see in the Malaysia plans as well that climate change is being integrated more and more, and moving from more of a silo approach embedded, as action in environmental sort of thrusts to being cross-cutting, and we hope to see that being strongly reflected, I think, in the forthcoming 12th Malaysia plan. And perhaps whilst, some of these policy commitments could have been, stronger in the past, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has actually brought home the stark reality of what the looming climate crisis could entail. So hence, I think it's great actually to see several positive policy developments recently. Particularly, for example, this week we had the meeting of the Malaysian Climate Action Council that was chaired by the Prime Minister, and he announced 6 new approaches, which includes the development of a green recovery plan from the COVID crisis, and also things like a low mobility plan and other things.
Can I ask you though, Malaysia is often, and our critics, ourselves really, always note that we design great plans. The problem seems to be not in the planning or even conceptualization or even in the fanfare around announcing these great visions, but in the implementation, especially in terms of monitoring and data collection. I mean, is there a gap between the stated commitments and and ground realities?
Thank you. I mean, you're right. I think it's very fair to say that that's been the experience in Malaysia. We have quite beautiful plans. So this is why I think it's interesting. The other thing that happened this week, the ministry in charge, the Ministry of Environment and Water, CASA, they organized a multi-stakeholder meeting, roundtable, and we were also, WWF was also part of the group that organized this. Multi-stakeholder, because the realization of all these plans actually needs a whole of society approach. And so it was good that the stakeholder deliberations were instigated at the government level by the ministry. And they had, started discussing, okay, what are the potential pathways towards low emissions development economy. And to that end, I'm also happy to say that WWF Malaysia and Boston Consulting Group, BCG, we are in fact working on an independent study to determine pathways towards what we call a net zero emissions economy. And we hope our findings will provide useful inputs to the larger government efforts. I think now is the time for us to also closely watch, contribute, and ensure that these plans, as you rightly say, which are quite nicely crafted, also get implemented. We don't have time to waste. Yeah.
Can I ask you about Malaysia's role in the global conversation about climate change? Yes, we're not going to the US virtual summit next week, but the one in November, the UN COP26, is going to be one that we want to have a say in. What would you like us to be thinking about going into COP26? We should probably be going with a little bit of heft and a good report card. So what would you like to see in the next few months?
I think, if we can actually showcase quite a number of things that we are, in a way, doing, right? Sometimes Malaysia, maybe we don't know how to market ourselves very well. Now, I'll give you some examples of some of the more positive trends we are seeing. One is, we saw last week, possibly the first effort in making the vaccination program a green one. So last week, this green vaccination program was launched. And really that's a good effort to mainstream environmental management by integrating it into a very deep-rooted concern that touches all Malaysians.
Right.
So I understand that there's going to be efforts to offset the carbon that arises from the whole process of vaccination and all that. So in a way, this is a new approach where you bring environmental concerns very much into the heart of other things which normally would be considered to be separate.
Okay, sorry, we just have a minute left. I want to add this one last question for you, which has got to do with governance and assumptions that the federal government's in complete control of the situation. We've had, over the last 5 years, 3 governments, and we know now also there's an increasing demand for autonomy, especially from the territories of Sabah and Sarawak. And Sarawak being a huge state with such a powerful impact on the environment, wanting to, in some ways, go its own way. Are you concerned about the question of governance when it comes to these national plans?
Yeah, well, I think governance is definitely of, huge concern, but it's the way you approach it. Now, I think the thing that we need to look at really carefully is how we manage our forests, right? So that's always been a subject matter of governance and this kind of regional differences. But I think there are efforts now, for example, to bring finance into it. So the government has been looking at some innovative approaches. For example, the REDD plus financing framework have also been in the last budget and previous budgets, the announcement of ecological fiscal transfers to incentivize the keeping of forests by state. And of course, forests are a very important resource for addressing climate change.
Right.
So, in terms of governance, I think these are kind of new tools that we need to employ to make sure that, we are doing the right thing across the board.
Right. Lavanya, thank you so much for speaking with us on the show tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but more in just a couple of minutes. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned.
ada ke depan kita boleh maju. Induknya adalah Melayu
balik kepada
Islam.
This is orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan kita boleh maju. Induknya adalah Melayu
balik kepada
Islam.
This is
orang yang membuat
polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope.
Serta video tanpa had dengan scroll tanpa henti. Buat turun aplikasi baru Astro AWANI sekarang.
Semua yang terjadi adalah berita, tetapi tiada siapa yang boleh bawakan yang terkini dan tergempar seperti kami.
Dilihat hanya memberi wang tanpa matlamat yang tepat. Dia tidak melakukan apa-apa kesalahan.
Untuk mendapatkan jawapan yang bermakna, kita perlu soalan yang tepat.
Amat sedih dengan apa yang berlaku ke atas.
Tiada ruang untuk berita palsu.
Negara kita telah merekodkan kes harian baru sebanyak
hanya
You're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation about Malaysia's policy commitment in addressing the climate crisis. Alizan Mahdi is Director of Research at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. Previously, he worked with the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister and the Chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Alizan, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, I want to begin our conversation with getting your thoughts on what you made of that kerfuffle or controversy about Malaysia not being invited to the US Leaders Summit on Climate. What did you make of that?
Thank you, and first of all, good evening, and thank you for having me here tonight. I think, first of all, we must understand that the US Climate Summit is not part of the official international intergovernmental climate change process that is conducted through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or otherwise known as the UNFCCC, but rather is organized by one country as part of its own climate diplomacy initiative. So in this sense, I don't think it is really a major issue for any country really not to be invited, nor am I very surprised that Malaysia was not invited. Now, the reasons why Malaysia was not invited specifically, well, you would have to ask President Biden's administration for that. But from what we can gather, the invitations are based on a few criteria, of which are, firstly, as I made to understand, members of the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate Change are invited, and this consists of major economies that contribute to about 80% of the global carbon emissions, of which, of course, Malaysia is not part of. Secondly, countries that are especially vulnerable to climate change are also invited, and this is a major debate that we have been having, whether Malaysia is or not vulnerable to climate change, but I'm sure we can touch on that later. But I also must add here that countries that are obviously vulnerable to climate change, such as the Philippines, were also not invited to the summit. Thirdly, countries that are charting innovative pathways towards a net zero economy are also invited, and in this case, Malaysia has not set any targets for net zero carbon or emissions pathway. And finally, countries that demonstrate strong climate leadership, and of course this is subjective and it is up to the United States and Biden's administration to determine who is demonstrating strong climate leadership, but this can also be gathered by the countries nationally determined contributions, or the NDC. So my overall take is it's not a major issue that Malaysia was not invited. Nonetheless, there may be an argument to be made that Malaysia is not seen as a strong climate, demonstrating strong climate leadership, and could be called towards action towards it. But
yeah,
really
Alizan,
the key thing.
Can you help us understand? I mean, if you were, as it were, the leader of the country, would you aspire for this? I mean, is that something you think at this point in time, considering both the political and economic and public health crisis, that we have the space to think of ourselves as a leader in this area? Our previous guest pointed out many of the achievements that were made by the Malaysian delegation to these global conversations. But today, is that the same? Could we just step back and let other countries lead, especially those in the region, Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia being the countries that were invited to the, or are going to be part of that US summit?
Yeah, it really depends on the priorities of the leadership, really. In one way, you can see that some climate action can be politically controversial. For example, if we were to have strong climate action, if we were to have carbon tax, for example, it will most likely be an unpopular move, especially to a few vested interests and especially to the private sector, which requires, especially in the time of COVID-19, it will require further additional tax. So in that sense, it may be a challenge. On the other hand, as we have seen from various efforts in terms of recovering from COVID-19, many countries are going for Green New Deals, etc., to build back better. And Malaysia, as a trading nation, could also demonstrate its leadership in demonstrating to our trading partners that Malaysia is ready, that Malaysia has the policies to comply with the highest standards that are required, especially in a post-COVID world. So I think it really depends on the priorities of.
Right. Are you seeing that, Alizan? I mean, I'm sure you're watching government policy very closely. Are you seeing Malaysia build back better and incorporating climate change responses into the recovery of the economy through our policies, through our plans, through our programs?
I think my answer for that is still waiting to see. At this moment, in my view, there hasn't been very strong response in terms of or clarity in terms of building back better and incorporating climate change responses within our recovery. However, we just recently, a few days ago, there was the MyCAC, the Malaysian Climate Action Council, which actually highlighted that one of the pathways for Malaysia moving forward is to have a Green New Deal. So I think there is momentum. Recently, there has been a lot of announcements. There has been establishment of various institutional arrangements, such as the Climate Action Council, and there has been recent commitments towards incorporating climate change responses towards Build Back Better. So I would say let's wait and see. As well as going back to the first question regarding the summit, I think the key thing here for Malaysia to show its leadership is it's not necessarily through the US Climate Summit, but it's actually through the official process, which is the UNFCCC, which we have the COP26 at the end of this year. And at this moment, Malaysia is reviewing its nationally determined contributions, NDC. So I think that is the platform where we really show whether we will demonstrate climate leadership.
Right, on a domestic front, you've written that Budget 21 had an explicit environmental sustainability focus, but you also noted that in terms of allocations, the allocations amounted to less than 1%, which doesn't compare favorably to maybe more developed nations. How do you square that? You know, a recognition, but then a lack of commitment, at least in financial terms, to these plans?
Yeah, okay, first of all, just to clarify as well, Malaysia does not have climate budget tagging. So what that means is climate change is, of course, a systemic issue. It's being addressed across various ministries and so on. So there are actually certain budget allocated across the various ministries, but because we do not have the climate budget tagging, we actually do not know the actual figure. So it may be more than 1%. My guess is it would be more than 1% if we did have the climate budget tagging.
Could I just get you to elaborate what climate budget tagging means and why don't we have it?
So essentially, it's just tagging which budget allocation is related to climate responses. So for example, we have within KPKT, the Ministry of Local Housing, we have programs such as Low Carbon City Framework, which is related to addressing climate change at the local level. And I'm not sure if this is incorporated within the budget allocated for the environment, for example. So if we tag all that budget that is relevant to climate change across the various ministries, it may be higher. Similar with, we have policies on EEV, efficient electrical vehicles. And again, I'm not sure if those are tagged with the environment allocation. So I think if we do have the climate budget tagging, it would actually help to see the bigger picture and see our responses in a more holistic way.
Right, if I could ask you to help us understand something that you, again, you wrote about, and this was the Forest Plantation Development Loan Program. I think our previous guest also made reference to it. It says there's a revolving 500 million ringgit fund, but you say that in a strange way or in a paradoxical way, it might pose a threat to biodiversity and forest protection if not managed in a sustainable way. So could you help us understand some of these tensions within the budget allocations that are in fact there that seem to be tagged to environmental sustainability?
Sure. And of course, the key issue here is that forests and natural resources essentially is within the constitution under the jurisdiction of the states. And here when we talk about forest plantations in the context of Malaysia, forest plantations can also be production forests as well as forest reserves. So in that sense, it depends the utilization of that forest, whether if it's for production, it could be counterproductive to sustainability because it will also mean further deforestation, which means further land use change, which also means further increases of emissions from the land use change sector. So it really depends if it is managed in a sustainable manner or not.
All right. Very quickly, Alizan, in the minute or so that we have left, can I ask you, coming back to what you said about it all depends on the priorities of the leadership, right? The priorities of the government. Where would you like to see more urgency come from the government in addressing the climate crisis specifically?
Okay, I think more, first of all, more generally, the key challenge with climate change I see in Malaysia is most of the efforts up to now has been quite piecemeal. It's been driven by one ministry, although those ministries have changed in recent years, but essentially it's driven by the Environment Ministry. And I think the announcement that we will be having a Green New Deal would help, but really we need a cross-cutting climate change policy that addresses various sectors. At the moment, we still have conflicting, again, priorities. For example, the automotive policy still pushes for producing more cars rather than moving towards public transport and so on. So I think it really needs to be a whole of government approach. That's first of all. But more specifically, I think when we look at Malaysia's climate change emissions, of course, the energy sector contributes to about 80% of Malaysia's carbon emissions. So ultimately, we cannot run away from moving towards decarbonizing our energy systems, moving towards renewable energy. And for that, we do have fairly ambitious targets to move towards about 31% renewable energy by 2025 and so on. So I think we cannot, but it has to be very urgent. I think this is the key thing. We cannot move away from decarbonizing our energy systems. And finally, specifically as well, is in terms of climate change adaptation. Ultimately, Malaysia is blessed being a mega biodiverse country. We have tropical forests. I think this is our key identity in the context of internationally, really. So I think we really need to look into nature-based solutions to preserving our forests.
Okay. Right. Alizan,
so
thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. Before we leave you, a quick reminder, don't forget to get all the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
We will be back with you same time tomorrow. Till then,
good night.
Good night.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada support system. This is
orang yang
action.
Polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.